where we're reading in verse 12 called Thanksgiving and Prayer. It's an extended section in this particular letter. Paul gushes thanksgiving for the church in Philippi. He's got a very good relationship with them, and they have their own concern for Paul because at this point he's in prison, he's awaiting trial, and so then we read these words at verse 12. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. It is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing that they can stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. This is the word of the Lord. D.A. Carson believes that there's many North American Christians, maybe you and I included, who aren't fully committed to the gospel. And so he writes, actually quite cuttingly, he writes this: I would like to buy about $3 worth of gospel, please. I mean, not too much. I mean, not enough, but just enough to make me happy, but not so much that I get addicted. I mean, I don't want so much gospel that I learn to really hate covetousness and lust. I mean, I certainly don't want to have so much that I start to love my enemies, or cherish self-denial, or even contemplate missionary service in some alien culture. I want ecstasy, not repentance. I want transcendence, not transformation. I would like to be cherished by some nice, forgiving, broad-minded people, but I myself don't want to love all my neighbors, especially those who should just get a job. I would like enough gospel to make my family secure and my children well-behaved, but not so much that I find my ambitions redirected or my giving too greatly enlarged. I would like about $3 worth of gospel, please. Now, that is, of course, ludicrous, isn't it? Or is it? I mean, when you think about it, what is worse, to proclaim outright that we only want a domesticated version of the gospel, that we would like just $3 worth of gospel, or to claim with our lips that the gospel is first in our lives, while our actions and our priorities indicate a far different story? If you are a fan of late-night TV, if you can endure that late, which I often cannot, you'll know that Stephen Colbert is going to succeed David Letterman hosting The Late Show this fall. Now, I have a fellow seminary student, a guy I went to seminary with, Rich Braxma, who wrote this book this spring. It's called Telling the Truthiness, the Gospel According to Stephen Colbert. And Rich Braxma, he reminds us that good comedy is about more than just getting laughs. Good comedy tells the truth. It reveals that the emperor has no clothes. It shines light in dark corners of the world. And I don't want to trample on anybody's toes here, and so whatever politics you might see in Stephen Colbert, he's also no stranger to trivial silliness. He has sayings like this: there's an old saying about those who forget history. I don't remember it, but it's good. Or he's said on his show, why is it a bad thing to lose touch with reality? Have you seen reality lately? It's terrible. Or this is also quite cutting. Here's an easy way to figure out if you're in a cult. If you're wondering whether you're in a cult, the answer is yes. But for our purposes this morning, I think this one is perhaps the most cutting. If this is going to be a Christian nation that doesn't help the poor, either we have to pretend that Jesus was just as selfish as we are, or we've got to acknowledge that he commanded us to love the poor and serve the needy without condition, and then admit that we just don't want to do it. Every Christian that I encounter, that I talk to, really wants to put the gospel first in their lives. I do. But it can be quite difficult. I mean, how can we do that? Put the gospel first when our kids or our parents overwhelm us? Or when our job or our health or our spouse or not having a spouse, when these things eat away at us? How can we put the gospel first when our lives are just pulling us in a million different directions? It's difficult, and to be honest, it's more difficult than many Christians care to admit out loud. But Paul's words today are an encouragement. He demonstrates that the prayerful support of a community of believers and the help given by Jesus Christ himself do indeed give us what we need to put the gospel first. So someone asks you, how you doing? I mean, just in the fellowship hall before the service, I must have heard it half a dozen times. How you doing? Do you ever respond kind of absent-mindedly, or at least with the shortest possible answer in the time given? Good, fine, I'm okay. I certainly know that I'm guilty of responding in that fashion. I mean, how you doing? Wow, family's good. Work's going well. Same old. I'm surviving. Well, the dog just had puppies, whatever, the case may be at the time. Well, in his letter to the Philippians, Paul does something actually quite remarkable. He gives a stunning answer to the question, how are you doing? Remember that in Paul's day, letter writing had certain conventions. It was fairly structured, and these letters had a predictable way of greeting, and it had salutations, and there's often a section that described how the writer was doing. And the reading that we had for today included the section where Paul is expected to describe how he's doing. I mean, after all, the Philippian Christians are eager to hear, how is Paul being treated in jail? What's it like for him? Are the guards being nice to him? Are they taking care of him? Is he getting enough to eat? I mean, it's the how you doing kind of section of the letter. And so what does Paul report? Does he say, well, I'm good, as well as can be expected, can't complain. Arthritis is acting up a little bit, my food's a bit bland. I'm happy the weather's been cool because the air conditioner broke last week. Well, how does he answer this question? He doesn't do anything like that, in fact. With his dear Philippian Christian brothers and sisters hanging on his every word, Paul surprisingly says very little about his physical condition, his surroundings, that they don't already know. Instead, what we get is verse 12. I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. And so really, instead of reporting how he is doing, Paul talks much more about how the gospel is doing. And so to the question of how it is with him, the apostle reacts with information about how it is with the gospel. He in effect, puts the gospel first. But Paul invests not just $3 worth, but everything in the gospel. He's invested his whole life. He's gone all in. And Paul explains why he's doing so good. And there are two real surprising ways that the gospel is advancing. And the first reason Paul's doing so well is found in verse 13. It has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that Paul is in chains for Christ. So Paul's doing well because, as he explains, the gospel is making inroads with the Roman guards. He's doing well because the good news of Jesus Christ is doing what it's supposed to, namely transforming lives. And that's the criteria for how well Paul's doing. And it makes me wonder about my own criteria for that question, how you doing? What are your criteria? When somebody asks you how you doing, I mean, it depends. I know if you're passing through and somebody asks you how you doing, somebody at the supermarket says how you doing, well, it might be a little more cursory, but a good friend, somebody from your family, somebody that you're well connected with says how you doing. How do you answer? For me, it often has to do maybe with how I'm feeling, with my level of happiness, the circumstances of my day or of my week, the health of my family, personal success or failure. Is there any pain or sorrow in my life? Is there joy in my social life, in my friendships, and so on? Those are the kinds of ways that I answer that question. But Paul's criteria have a whole different level. Is the good news of Jesus Christ transforming, reconditioning your life or the lives of those with whom you are in close contact? Those are different criteria. And then there's this second set of kind of shocking reason that Paul's feeling so good, and those are found in verse 14. It's because of Paul's chains that other Christians have been encouraged to speak the gospel more courageously and fearlessly. And what Paul does here is he doesn't pretend or make out like it's he himself that's inspiring so powerfully other Christians to this confidence in proclaiming the gospel. No, he doesn't do that. Paul knows that it's because of his chains. Paul knows that it's because of what might seem the most demoralizing, feeble thing about him, the fact that he is in chains. Paul knows that it's because of his weakness that Christians are gaining confidence to proclaim this good news. And so, as elsewhere Paul writes, God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise. God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. And maybe as you hear that, maybe you're tempted to think like I am anyways. Well, I mean, that's true of Jesus and of Paul, these, pretty big wigs in the Christian story. I mean, they're the ones who can startle the world wise and powerful by journeying to a cross, by suffering in chains for the gospel. But I certainly don't fit that mold, do I? I hope I'm not overgeneralizing, but I think it's safe to say that most of us, most of the time, we play by the world's rules, right? We count on working hard enough. We count on being smart enough. We count on being strong enough. We count on being popular enough. But it's never enough, right? The good news here again proclaimed by Paul is that our weakness is good enough, that our foolishness is wise enough, and that our feeble frames are strong enough for God to work in and even through. One of my favorite writers puts it this way: what is both good and new about the good news is the mad insistence that Jesus lives on among us, not just as another haunting memory, but as the outlandish, holy, and invisible power of God, working not just through the sacraments, but in countless hidden ways to make even slobs like us loving and whole beyond anything we could conceivably pull off ourselves. Because essentially, what's so good about the good news if it's no different than the world news, right? What's so good about the good news if it reads exactly the same as the 11 o'clock news? Rich get richer, poor get poorer. Powerful subdue powerless. Brilliance pays dividends. No. Instead, gospel headlines read maybe a lot smaller and a lot more like this: poor find strength in weakness. Fools for Christ show the way. Chains inspire boldness. Gospel brings life through death. And if you're not convinced, which I can understand you might not be, consider this. Have you ever noticed, if you look back at church history, that the church seems to grow the most during times of weakness and suffering? Look at history, but also look at